This week on Quadriga, Obama and Europe. Love on the rocks. U.S. President Barack Obama is preparing to visit Europe for a G8 summit and a major speech in Berlin. His last visit to the German capital in 2008, shortly before he became president, was a triumph. But the U.S. policy to escalate the use of drones to kill suspected terrorists tarnished expectations. Hopes had been high that Obama's presidency would lead to more peace. Failure to close the prison in Guantanamo Bay also disappointed many Europeans. So too Obama's support for the NSA's electronic surveillance program. So are these issues signs the U.S. and Europe are growing apart? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. The transatlantic relationship was the cornerstone of U.S. and European foreign policy during the Cold War. But much has changed since then, and so it seems have the priorities for both sides. President Obama is expected in Northern Ireland and Germany next week. Time for us to take a look at what sets the two apart and what do both sides still have in common. And for that, I am joined by three experts who've been following transatlantic relations for a very long time. Welcome to Alan Posener, who is a correspondent and commentator for the German newspaper Die Welt. He's also one of Germany's most influential bloggers and has recently published a biography of John F. Kennedy. Tom Goeller is the former Germany correspondent for the Washington Times and has in turn reported many years from the US for various German publications. And Karen Leigh is a US journalist and the managing editor of News Deeply. She has also written for Time magazine, The Atlantic and Foreign Policy, and has covered the 2008 US elections for Bloomberg News. Welcome to you all. Much to talk about, many topics to cover indeed. And let's start with the most current, Alan Posener, the U.S. surveillance program, now known as PRISM. The National Security Agency, as we now know, has obtained mails and phone records of U.S. citizens, in Germany in particular. How much of a hiccup is this, do you think, in U.S.-European relations?
Well, it's a public relations disaster, but I don't think that anyone in the know, no matter what they say in public, is shocked by this. It's obvious that this is what secret services do. This is what intelligence services do. They gather information. They're looking for needles in haystacks. And the internet is a haystack. That means they have to take this haystack apart to find it.
So you're saying the Europeans were aware of this program?
Of course they were. They will deny it. And I bet that in all the security forces all over Europe, they're busy shredding documents now which prove that they know it. But of course, and you know, if I, as a German, ask myself what my security intelligence services are doing, if they're not checking the internet, what the hell are they doing? I mean, it's obvious that's where you find these guys. Telephone records, that's where you find their communications networks. Come on, let's be realistic about this. I'm glad the US is doing it. I'm afraid Germany might not be doing it.
Well, Chancellor Merkel has already said that she will approach this subject matter with President Obama when he visits Berlin next week. A lot of EU parliamentarians were outraged, and you're saying they knew about it all along?
Well, I don't know about European parliamentarians because they're a notoriously dim-witted bunch. But I'm sure that Chancellor Merkel knows all about this, and of course she'll bring it up, and she'll ask him, have you got any new information for me, Barack? And he'll say, well, you know, ask my intelligence director, and he'll be forthcoming. Come on.
Tom Goeller, this PRISM, the surveillance program, then, as Alan Posener is claiming, is a surveillance program not just on behalf of the US, but Europeans as well?
Well, first of all, I would like to agree that the Germans are not really surprised by this, especially since we know that the German Secret Service for Foreign Affairs, the German dependence to the CIA, the BND, right, did surveillance on Spiegel reporters a couple of years ago. And so they are all in the same boat. I agree it is a public affairs problem, first of all, or a disaster for Obama, and not so much a problem between Mrs. Merkel or President Obama. And of course, she has to make it to a topic to satisfy her voters or to satisfy the German public. But basically, that's it. It's not a big issue between both of them.
Well, currently, assuming that Alan Posener is correct and that EU politicians, or at least high-ranking officials, have known about this PRISM surveillance program all along, I think it's safe to say that the average citizen did not. Here is President Obama, who's defending the surveillance program, saying it is absolutely essential in the U.S. fight against terrorism. What do you make of this?
You know, he has defended it, and I think it's like they were saying, it is the biggest public relations disaster Obama could have. It's deepening this distrust that Americans have for Obama, especially among youth. I think a lot of people under 40 are saying, you know, he hasn't lived up to his campaign promises, he's wishy-washy on Syria, he's not gotten us out of Afghanistan, he hasn't done all of these things he promised, and now he's spying on us. And this is the biggest thing in America. I mean, this is the worst thing you can do to an American citizen, is say, I'm taking away a civil liberty, I'm encroaching on your computer. You know, I'm looking at what you're searching on YouTube and Google, and people are paranoid now and they're upset. And they're going to be looking now to see, you know, are there other leaders who are doing a better job? Is there somebody else who we can look to and say, you know, Obama, live up to that? And that could be Merkel.
And you've already said about the shrinking popularity, if you will, on the part of President Obama. What a difference 5 years make. Let's look at what happened in 2008. 2008, obviously, 200,000 people turned out at Berlin's Victory Column to hear not President Obama, but the presidential contender, President Obama, speak. A lot of disappointment, at least on the part of Europeans, have followed since then. Isn't that true?
A lot of disappointment, and that's something Americans and Europeans share, is this growing disappointment with Obama. And hey, he was supposed to be changed. And I was on the campaign trail with him in 2008, and we stood there, and there were crowds. You know, there were people sitting in a lake on a boat watching him from a distance. I mean, people were so excited. And he's just done everything wrong. He's done everything wrong in terms of making people like him and living up to these expectations. And here's the worst thing he can do. And now he comes back to, Berlin, and I think it's going to be a very different reception. I think it's going to be an excited reception. I think there'll be a lot of people excited to see him, excited to see what he has to say. People will definitely come out. There'll be a big crowd, but I don't think there'll be the same fervor that there was. I don't think there'll be the same era of expectation that there was.
And indeed, Alan Posener, the excitement, if you will, is not really in the air these days. He will speak. President Obama is scheduled to speak in front of the Brandenburg Gate next week. But a lot of Europeans in particular are blaming him, are faulting him for not being able or not willing to be able to close Guantanamo, not to continue the drone strikes. Now the PRISM public affairs, public scandal. There's just no winning for him these days in Europe, is there?
Well, no, but I mean, that's the Europeans' fault. I mean, come on. They turned out, I was there, they turned out in Berlin because he wasn't George W. Bush. They didn't turn out because they really had any idea what kind of policy an American president has to do, no matter which party he belongs to. And of course, he has to ensure the security of the American people first and foremost. He swears his oath on that as commander-in-chief. So of course he's going to attack terrorists with drones. He wanted to close Guantanamo. He couldn't find a legal way of doing so. Congress stopped him. So before people start criticizing the president, first criticize Congress, and secondly, ask yourself what you're going to do with these bad guys who you know are going to go out there and start doing terrorism again, and who they can't get rid of anyway. I mean, we Germans are the last people who should be worrying, who should be complaining about Guantanamo. We had a guy in there, a guy called Murat Kornas. And the Americans wanted to let him go. And it was the German government, not Ms. Merkel, but the one before that, Gerhard Schröder, who said, no, we don't want him here. This is a troublemaker. You keep him, right? And he came back here, and he did cause trouble, arson, you name it. You know, and now he's pretending to be this innocent guy. So, come on, get real, Europeans. This is the real problem with American-German relations is and always has been that the Germans and the Europeans are not realistic.
Well, I actually would like to pick up this real or realistic that way that I would say President Obama had to learn, and he quickly learned that he has to be a realpolitik politician, and he did this for the European taste too quickly. But actually, to announce that he will change the world, you know, change was his program. But if this word is the only part of the program you have, yes, of course, the entire world, not only the Europeans, not only the Americans, also in Dubai and in Kuala Kuala Lumpur. They expected something from him. Obama is not only the president of the United States, he actually is a world leader. So from a world leader, you expect new perspectives. And actually what he signaled is, I will overcome this reactionary realpolitik of this old-fashioned reactionary Henry Kissinger and fill it with idealism. I have an ideal. I am in the footsteps of, the Germans would say, of Immanuel Kant or of Martin Luther King. But he did not fulfill this promise. And this is not only his fault. It's not only he did something wrong. It's also the Europeans who did not actually support him enough. For example, if we are really convinced in the Western world, and here we are at common values, if we think that we have to turn the entire world into democracies because democracies never fight each other, then we come back to Immanuel Kant, and this is a very genuine German philosopher who talked about eternal peace, right? So if Merkel would know her philosopher Kant, and if Obama could follow his ideal or his icon, Martin Luther King, they both could have changed the world. Both did not.
So you're pleading for a philosophy 101 course for all European politicians, as I understand it. But Karen Leigh, let's look at the poll numbers that President Obama got in Europe before he took on Mitt Romney. Still, obviously, they weren't eligible to do so. But a lot of Europeans said they would, in overwhelming numbers, would vote for Obama still. Yeah. For a re-election. Do you think that Europeans have a somewhat naive, perhaps immature look on the U.S. and President Obama in particular?
You know, I wouldn't say immature. I would say liberal. I would say, you know, nobody knew what nobody knew what Romney was about. Romney kind of came in and he had these very wishy-washy policies, especially on foreign policy, which is
very precise.
Not at all, which is something that the European public obviously is going to care a lot about when looking at an American president. I think they thought Obama had a good relationship with Merkel that he'd worked to foster over the last 4 years. And I think they didn't really want to change horses in midstream. You know, they don't want to suddenly jump to something else that they don't know. I would be interested to know how they felt now. And if that's, you know, in the last 4 months taken any kind of hit, and especially a year out, the next couple of years. I think that, you know, maybe they didn't want Romney, but they definitely want something else. I think they want an American president who's a bit more like Merkel, just in that he makes decisions and sticks to them.
Well, obviously, the moods, that's for another show. Sorry. Well, obviously, things were very different 50 years ago, especially in 1963. A year and June 1963 in particular, a month and a year that is being evoked many times these days because it marks the 50th anniversary of the very famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech by President John F. Kennedy. And we are seeing some pictures of his visit back then. Alan Posener, you wrote a biography of John F. Kennedy, just recently published. Obviously, very different times. It was in the midst of a Cold War. John F. Kennedy was being perceived as a savior back then. How would you compare, as impossible as it may be, how would you compare those two visits, President Obama and John F. Kennedy?
Well, I would compare Obama and Kennedy insofar as they both had much more form than substance, and they both inspired more hope than they could ever deliver on, which is your point. But let's not forget that when Kennedy came here, let's not over-romanticize it, he was in deep, deep trouble with Europe. He had allowed the Berlin Wall to be built, not that he had an alternative, but he had almost forced the Russians to do so by saying, we will not do anything against anything you do in your part of Berlin. And that really angered the Europeans. And he was faced with a European revolt. Charles de Gaulle had taken France out of NATO. He had refused to let Great Britain into the forerunner of the European Union. Things don't change much, do they? And on account of saying that Britain was too transatlantic, was a Trojan horse for America, and the German government under Chancellor Adenauer was sort of flirting with the idea of going Gaullist. And that's why Kennedy had to come to prove to Adenauer that he was so popular in Germany that you couldn't do policy against him. And this was a gamble, because people in Berlin, for instance, in 61, 62 had been really angry at Kennedy about the wall. He took this great gamble on his popularity, and it paid off entirely. From that point on, there was no more talk of Gaullism in Germany. So that was one point where he took a big chance, which Obama, by the way, isn't doing. He's only having invited guests in front of the Brandenburg Gate. So Kennedy, in that respect, though he relied on his form over substance, and it really paid off. But it was a very bad situation for America then.
And Tom Goeller, so Alan Posener is saying it took some time for JFK to come to Berlin, and certainly it took some time for President Obama to come to Berlin as a president. It is almost custom that most U.S. presidents, particularly after World War II, come to Germany during their first term. Yeah. President Obama did not do so. Many people took that as a sign. Would you?
Well, actually, I would...
As a sign for the diminishing significance of Germany and Europe.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think many Germans, I'm one of them, has enough of that American presidents want to hold a speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate. It's kind of also a bit of an abuse of a German symbol. What for? Could you imagine that Mrs. Merkel would hold a speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial and talk about freedom and liberty and kind of teach the Americans that they are nuts with their gun manianism, or that they understand freedom only through guns? So I have two hearts beating in my chest, so to say about the analogism between the John F. Kennedy visit and Obama's visit. I do see another link. For example, we do know today from the biographies of Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of Berlin at that time, and his man behind the throne, Egon Bahr, that actually Kennedy rose more concern at that time for both of them. And this is why they then invented the approach to the East and wanted to reconcile with Russia. And I do see a similarity to today with Merkel and Obama, because Merkel knows she has to go her own way. She cannot rely any longer. As Willy Brandt noticed, I cannot rely on the Americans, really. They follow their own interests, and Merkel knows she needs to, well, take more burden on her shoulders, and the Americans won't be as reliable as we thought they were before.
And we'll talk more about how reliable Americans are as a partner for Europe and vice versa, by the way. But currently, I want to come back just one more quickly towards the upcoming Obama visit. He wanted to speak in front of the Brandenburg Gate as a presidential contender. Chancellor Merkel denied him that right or privilege, as you might call it. Do you think there are still some hard feelings between the two?
Yeah, they have an interesting relationship. It's always on the rocks, and I think they've done a lot of work to get it back. It's, we've made jokes about how it's almost romantic now because they've kind of cuddled up to each other. But they're both very standoffish. They're both very austere, and when she didn't, say, yes, come, we love the idea of you making a speech, he got a little bit offended, and I think now they've repaired it. And she said, you're more than welcome to come speak anytime at any gate you want. And apparently he served strudel and played You've Got a Friend at a state dinner. And they've made amends. But there is that underlying hard feelings. They didn't get off to a great start. They're not best friends, but they've worked on it. And, it might be a stronger relationship because of that.
Stronger relationship between Germany and the U.S., perhaps, but there are still many issues that divide the U.S. and Europe in particular. And let's go through them. The most important, perhaps, these days is the euro crisis. America very much criticizes the austerity-driven response by the Europeans to the euro crisis. America would like to see Europeans to stimulate growth instead, whereas Europeans and Germans in particular are asking, sometimes politely and sometimes not so diplomatically, the Treasury Secretary to mind his own business. The austerity-driven response by the Europeans, Alan Posener, is something that Washington, D.C. would like to see reversed. Rightly so?
Oh, definitely. You could say what you like against John Maynard Keynes, but one thing is clear. If you're in a hole, stop digging. If you're in a recession, throw money at the problem. This is what Obama did. And you can criticize him for not throwing enough money at the problem. But he's got America back on a growth track. Obviously, there's big problems ahead. He's got to somehow find money. He's got to save money in the future. But you don't start saving when you're in the middle of a crisis. So that's one thing he really got right. And the Germans, especially, who drove austerity in Europe, got really, really wrong. And we've heard the latest report by the International Monetary Fund, who are, self-critical about their reaction to the crisis in Greece. And you can go through all the numbers. You simply cannot accept 60% youth unemployment in a country like Spain. That is unacceptable. And if you're not doing something about that, and Germany is the main, and Mrs. Merkel is the main force responsible for that, then you are really hurting America, you're hurting China, you're hurting Europe, you're hurting everyone.
But Tom Goeller, Chancellor Merkel is saying we first need to get our own house in order because before we can care about stimulating growth.
Yes, absolutely. And I, with all due respect, I disagree with you that this blame game that Germany is responsible for everything in Europe is, for me, a very old argument and typically, with all due respect, a typically British one. Because whatever Germany did since 1948, it never could satisfy Great Britain.
Great Britain. This is the U.S. that is criticizing the austerity-driven
Great Britain was for a long time, and maybe still is, the porte-parole, the voice of the Americans in Europe. Coming to Obama, it was right to do what he did for the U.S., but the European systems are totally different from the United States. They are very more based on social security and give everyone a net, a hammock to survive. And the European societies are not so much based on that you have to care for yourself. You get a lot provided by the states. And if the states make mistakes like Spain did and Greece did, it was not the Germans' fault that they didn't have enough money, that they were unable to collect their taxes. So I'm a bit fed up with this finger pointing towards Merkel. What could she have better done than what she did for what Obama does for his nation, she did for her nation. This is both boom. Both are doing well. So what's wrong with Mrs. Merkel?
So clearly we are having an inner German debate here.
Well, the first thing is Americans like to assume that they are sort of pioneer spirit, everyone takes care of themselves, whereas the Europeans relax in their hammock, as you call it. All I can say is that Medicare, for instance, free medical help for the elderly, is pure socialism, which we would never have in Germany. And there's a whole lot of other American social programs which are far worse and far more expensive than anything we have in Europe. So let's get rid of that old canard, because it's just not the case. And the second thing is, what could Merkel have done? She is in a monetary union with countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, and France, and has been for the past 10 years. And that means you have to point the finger at the right time. No German politician anticipated the euro crisis. And of course, that's our fault, just as much as it was the fault of the politicians in those countries. We have to stop thinking in national categories. Within the Eurozone, we have one economy, and it's our responsibility, just as much as the Greeks or the Spanish, to take care of that.
Right. So currently, the euro crisis is obviously a big, hot, debated issue, not just between Americans and the Europeans, but also on the show between two Germans. But if we talk about money and if we talk about financial issues, the shift away from Europe has long started on the part of the US, hasn't it? The turn away from Europe towards Asia, because China obviously is the geopolitical competitor number one, if you will, of Washington, D.C., and let's not forget also the US's biggest creditor. Aside from the discontentment as far as how Europe is dealing with the euro crisis, do you think Europe as a marketplace still matters for the Americans?
I think I'd go so far as to say Europe has become irrelevant in the U.S. I think people are focused on China, they're focused on the BRICS, they're looking at who are our competitors. And Europe isn't seen as a competitor. Europe is seen as this great place to go visit. It's maybe the people who are going to help us go into Syria, but it's not really seen as the entity it was even 5-10 years ago. And I think people are really focused on, who's going to help us financially? How are we, who's our competitor? Americans are very competitive. We're always, are we the #1 nation in the world? Are we the #2 nation? And when you look at who's our competition, it's not going to be Germany or France or Spain. It's going to be China. To a degree, Russia, because we have a fascination with it. It's going to be India, it's going to be Brazil. And that's what Americans are thinking about now. They're not really thinking about Europe.
And a lot of people are saying that this focus on Asia also has a lot to do with President Obama himself. They're calling him the first Pacific president, if you will, of the United States, the first who perhaps was not shaped by World War II experiences. He grew up in Hawaii, lived in Indonesia, his father was from Kenya. Do you think that has something to do with it, or is just geopolitical realities?
I think it's a combination of both. I think when you have a leader who has experience in the region, who has a big fixation on the region, and when the region is coming up economically, and when the old region of power, Europe, is going down economically, you're going to look to the new region.
The old region is going down, says Karen Leigh. As an American, let's sure hope not.
Very provocative. I hear Donald Rumsfeld talking about old Europe, and old Europe is still there and holding up the flag. And actually, I couldn't disagree more with you about the irrelevance of Europe, because I see why President Obama turns to the Pacific. It's actually, as Henry Kissinger said recently, a readjustment to an area already President Nixon focused to, and the Americans always were kind of in love with China. But the new rising powers like India or China, what else but economic success can they provide? They don't share the same values with the United States, but Europe does. That's what we have in common. We have real values in common. Nobody is talking anymore about. For example, NATO provided for the past 60 or 50 years safety and security. This is something in no other region of the world, except of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's region, you have, neither in Latin America, nor in Africa, nor in Asia. Nowhere else but in Western Europe and in the United States.
But Tom Goeller, let's
the government provides safety for its people.
But let's talk about safety, and let's talk about security and foreign policy. The problem that Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, said, what is Europe's phone number? At the end of the day, saying that Europe lacks a common foreign and security policy. Doesn't it still hold true for today?
Yes. However, we should not emphasize what's going wrong. We really should remind ourselves what is right, what we can offer to the world. That is, for example, if the Germans sell cars to China, they also should sell values, labor values, rights for poor workers, and not just be happy that they can buy Levi jeans for $12 instead of $70 or $120.
But the American public likes that.
Everyone likes it, but it's wrong. It's simply wrong. And someone has to stand up and say it is wrong. And this is what I'm missing from Mr. Obama and what I'm missing from Mrs. Merkel, that they name the real problems and say it is wrong to deal with people or with nations that way, right?
Actually, this is what we're doing. This is why President Obama, and I agree totally here, is so keen on the free trade zone between the United States and the whole of Europe. And by the way, they don't ask what the phone number is. They know exactly where the phone number is. It's in Brussels. It's on the telephone of on the desk of Mr. Barroso. And we, as far as trade is concerned, Europe has been speaking with one voice for the past 10 years. It doesn't make the papers, but it's true. And this free trade zone would not only mean that goods between each other's main trading partners, that they would become cheaper. It would also mean that in the case of industrial standards, from medicines to jeans, from the working place to the way computers operate, Europe and America together would set the standard, the gold standard for the world, and not China and Japan and India. This is why this is so important. And this also shows that it's not really true that he's a Pacific president. He is, in fact, a very transatlantic president. And I think one of the things, the terrible thing is, he announces this free trade agreement. And what happens in Europe? The first thing is, German filmmakers point up and say, yeah, but then we're going to lose our subsidies. I mean, come on. Right? This is about a global step forward.
Yes.
You can't be petty about this.
Yes. And I think only with that we combine Europe and the United States, on an economic basis and on value basis, only that way we can really change the world. China for a long time wanted to become the real partner, the first number one partner of the United States. They even dream about a China-America and things like that, you know. But what they do not understand there is that if you want to be a partner on the same level with the United States, you have to share the same values. And the advantage for Europe is we share the same history, we share the same values, and so forth.
But Karen Leigh, sharing the same values is one thing, but does Europe also share the same burden as far as, for instance, foreign policy matters are concerned? Isn't it still the case that the Europeans are still most often than not are waiting for the U.S. to take the lead? In the case of Syria, for instance. In the case of Libya and Mali, they have taken the lead, but not in an orchestrated manner. In Mali it was the French. In Libya it was a combination of the French and the UK. In Syria, Europe is non-existent, if you will. What does it all tell you as Europe to be a diplomatic actor that wants to be taken serious by Washington?
You know, I mean, America certainly thinks that it's on its own with Syria, or at least going to be leading. It hopes that it will have the support of its allies here. It hopes that Merkel will change her hard line about we are not going in. But it doesn't know. And it's, you know, I think America's become very inward looking. It's, you know, we're on our own, we're doing this on our own, we're going to rebuild our economy, we're going to do this and that, we're going to go into Syria, and we're kind of on our own with it in terms of figuring out what we're doing. And before, they might have had more of a back and forth.
How much of the two perceived disasters, if you will, in Iraq and Afghanistan, how much did they all have to do with the hesitancy on the part of the U.S. to now stand up and make a mark in Syria?
Huge, huge. I mean, it's something that informs the decision every day, I think. And 68% of Americans do not want to go into Syria. They said, look, we had this debacle in Iraq, we had the debacle in Afghanistan. To a degree, we didn't do what we were supposed to do in Libya. We're sick of going into places on our own and shouldering the burden for the entire world. We don't have the full support of our allies in Europe. What are we doing this for? And we really, really don't want to go in. And so Obama's been very wishy-washy on it, and he, you know, doesn't want to go in either. His entire cabinet seems to want to go in, and he's been standing up against his advisors and saying, you know, I don't know. But there's no hard line coming out. You know, I think people have become very respectful of Merkel to a degree because she keeps saying, you know, we're not going to go in. And she's been very forceful about her opinion. And people are saying, why can't Obama have more of that attitude?
Well, Alan Posener, that doesn't bode well for the Syrian people, does it? A European foreign policy that is not orchestrated, and an America that is increasingly wants to lead from behind.
Oh, exactly. I think Obama is clear. He doesn't want to end his second term the way George Bush ended it, with fighting in a country which is a mess. And quite frankly, people who want to go into Syria, I always, you know, I want to ask them, who exactly are you going to support there? You know, and what is going to be the result? We've seen this in Libya. We went in, and what's been the result? We've seen this, of course, in Iraq. We've got in, and the Americans went in, and they've now got basically an ally of Iran on their hands. So I can understand not wanting to go in. A different question is, does Europe have a common foreign policy? And the answer is no, and that is really, really bad. And in fact, there you have to criticize. I know you don't like me criticizing Germany, but when Britain and France and the United States decided to do something against Colonel Gaddafi, for Germany not to have gone in, that's okay, but for Germany to abstain in the Security Council against two other EU members and her main ally in NATO, that was something which I think has shocked the Obama White House and, by the way, the British and the French deeply, and created an atmosphere of mistrust in Germany, in the Élysée Palace, in Whitehall, and in Washington, as far as foreign policy is concerned.
We are back to the point that whatever Germany decides, whether it moves in, whether it will be part of an invasion or not, I mean, Germany has its own experiences with invasions of other countries. You know, you cannot blame Germans that they hate invasions and that they won't make those mistakes again. And whatever you do as a German, you will be blamed by the British and French. Of course you will. From my perspective, this is this old attitude. The French French, the British, and the Americans do the same for the past 50 or 60 years. They have never an alternative to an international crisis but to invade, to have a military solution instead of a diplomatic one. We all know that in Syria there are totally other players in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all those guys, the oil-rich countries who really play a big role. We should make them, hold them accountable for the mess in Syria, and not always the Europeans shall solve an inner Syria problem. This is ridiculous. The Arabs even don't want that. They have enough of Christian invasions, they say. So what we in the West, the only thing we can do is to force the Arabs to solve their problems, eventually their own. As the Americans want that the Europeans shall solve their problems on the Balkan or in Greece, their own. Rightly so.
The first thing is, you can't compare anything we might or might not do in Syria or Libya with what Germany did, for instance, in Russia, in France, and so on in the Second World War. Come on. I mean, we are a democratic country, we are part of a democratic alliance, and if we decide to do something which is democratically legitimized by the United Nations, then you cannot compare it to what we did in the Second World War. So that's below the belt. That's not the way you argue. The second thing is, are there military solutions to problems? The very fact that the Second World War was solved militarily proves, of course, there are occasionally military solutions to political problems. And the point with Syria is not that we can solve everything militarily. The point is that Bashar al-Assad has an air force, he has superior firepower, and so on. And this is against the rebels. At least you could create an even playing field by bombing his airfields and knocking his air force out. And then we can see what happens and let the Arabs solve what then happens. But not to do anything simply gives the guy with the bigger guns the advantage.
But you see, time and again, you have only military solutions for really tough problems. And this is what I don't accept.
Syria, undoubtedly a very important subject matter, but let's stay focused here for the last few remaining minutes on transatlantic relationships as a whole. And let's look at the transatlantic relationships again in the 21st century. Karen Leigh, many people are saying that the relationship between the US and Europe is now, if you will, less emotional, not as close, if you will, but more grown up and pragmatic. Would you subscribe to that?
Yeah, I think I would. I think it's an adult relationship. I think they're figuring out what they need from each other instead of just clinging to each other over everything because that's the way it's been done. And I think individual issues are being scrutinized a bit more now. You also have leaders who are colder. Their personalities are different, so the relationship is going to be different. You don't have a Bill Clinton, you have an Obama, and then their way of dealing with people is very, very different. How much
does chemistry matter here, Alan Posener? At the end of the day, Chancellor Schroeder did not want Germany to be involved in the war in Iraq. That cost him, if you will, his friendship with George W. Bush. The relationship between Germany and the U.S. soured from there. How much do you think personalities matter?
Well, they matter, but I think that geopolitics matters more. We're in a multipolar world now. We have China, we have Russia. Russia's a dictatorship. China is still under the aegide of the Communist Party. Let's not forget that. India, Pakistan, atomic powers who are by no means, I mean, Pakistan is not a democracy, and so on. So, indeed, the shared values and also the shared interests in energy, in trade, in industrial production are going to keep America, the United States of America, Canada, and Europe together, no matter who is in the White House and who is in the Bundeskanzleramt.
Climate, another big issue and another divergence, if you will, of opinions between America and Europe, Germany in particular. Many people said that President Obama sided with India and China against Europe during the last summit in Copenhagen. Do you think, what do you see happening on that front?
You know, this is another area where people are disappointed in Obama. And, you know, you were supposed to be this progressive liberal president who was going to save the environment. And he hasn't done that. And he's taken steps almost in the other direction, or at least from the public perspective.
Yeah, but the public perspective is wrong. You get a state like Kansas or Iowa in the Midwest. They're producing 20% of their energy from wind already, which is a goal Germany has set itself, but hasn't got anywhere near it. So, you know, we like to think we're these great climate-friendly, sort of big, cuddly people, but in fact, the United States is doing more to protect the environment than Europe is doing. It's just that it's not projected. It's just that people do not want to see it because the figures are out there.
Yes, yes.
Tom Goeller,
I agree. Yeah.
the transatlantic relations, do they still matter in the 21st century?
Absolutely. This is where I disagree with this colleague from the United States very much, that I think there may a pivot of attention of the Americans to Asia, but what matters is Europe, because we are the genuine ally. We are the real one. We form one big geopolitical and valuable part of the world.
So Europe is still important, as important to the U.S. as it once
optimistic.
was?
I think in this perspective, I'm a realpolitiker.
Karen Leigh.
I will agree with him on that. It's a very entrenched relationship. And, you know, the new bonds you're forming in America, if you're forming a bond with Brazil or India, or these very exciting new kids on the block, it's economically based. And there's not that history. You know, when push comes to shove, if we really, really, really needed Germany on something, and Germany basically agreed, they would come to our aid. And I don't know if you have that with the new people yet. So you are looking at decades of history, and that does come into play.
Do you think that the U.S. sometimes is taking Europe perhaps even for granted?
A little bit, yeah. And when I was saying that, you know, it's become irrelevant, I didn't quite mean that. I just meant in the public perspective. People get, you know, Americans change their mind in 2 minutes and they get excited about the next thing and what's the next thing and, oh, well, we've been friends with them for 50 years, who cares? And they haven't stepped up and they haven't gone in with us where we needed them to go and this and that. And I don't know if there's a real appreciation for the depth of history that we have with a France, with a Germany, with the UK.
Alan Posener, is Europe the wife of 50 years that perhaps you don't need to tend towards as much as you used to?
I've been married for 40 years, and I can tell you that you definitely need to take care of your wife after 40 years. So stay with it. You have to work on it more when you get older.
Well, that is good news for the wife of Alan Posener, for sure, that Alan Posener still very much is investing in his relationship. Question is, how much is the U.S. investing into its relationship with Europe, and of course also vice versa, as this is not a one-way street. I want to thank my guests for their input on transatlantic relations in the 21st century. And we will see. President Obama is going to visit Berlin next week. We'll see how that all turns out. For now, thank you for tuning in and looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.